In 2018, a killer whale named Taloqua gave birth off the coast of Washington state. The calf lived for only about half an hour. And then, instead of letting the body sink, Taloqua pushed it to the surface with her head and kept it there. She carried her dead calf through the water for the next 17 days, across more than 1,000 miles of ocean. Every time the body started to sink, she dove down and lifted it back up. Researchers from the Center for Whale Research watched this happen day after day, unsure if she would ever stop. She was not eating properly. Other whales in her pod took turns helping her carry the calf when she grew too exhausted to continue alone. This was not an accident, and it was not instinct malfunctioning. So the question is simple, and it is one scientists have been arguing about for decades. Do animals grieve? And if they do, what does that actually mean about the line we have always drawn between them and us? Let's start with what grief actually requires, because that is where this gets complicated fast. For most of the 20th century, mainstream science treated animal emotion as a kind of forbidden topic. The dominant framework, built largely on the work of behaviorists like B.F. Skinner, argued that attributing human emotions to animals was bad science. It was called anthropomorphism, projecting human feelings onto creatures that could not possibly have them, and scientists who suggested otherwise risked their careers. Animals, according to this view, operated on instinct and conditioning. A mother whale carrying a dead calf was not grieving. She was simply exhibiting a malfunctioning maternal instinct, a biological glitch, nothing more. But that framework has been collapsing for decades, and the first major crack in it came from an unexpected place: elephants. In the 1980s, biologist Cynthia Moss, who has spent over 40 years studying elephants in Kenya's Amboseli National Park, began documenting something strange. When an elephant died, other elephants in the herd, even ones from unrelated families, would visit the body. They would touch the bones with their trunks, specifically the skull and tusks, running their trunks slowly over them again and again. Moss and her team ran an experiment. They placed elephant bones, along with the bones of other animals like buffalo and rhino, in the same area, and watched which ones elephants investigated. Elephants consistently spent far more time examining elephant remains than any other bones. They did not do this with buffalo skulls. They did this with elephant skulls, specifically. Elephants have also been observed standing silently around a dying or recently dead herd member for hours. In one widely documented case in Zambia, a matriarch named Eleanor collapsed and died over the course of a day. Other elephants from her own family and from unrelated families came to her body, one by one, over several days. They nudged her with their trunks. They stood guard over her. A researcher named Ian Douglas Hamilton, who founded Save the Elephants, described the behavior as consistent with something resembling mourning, though he was careful, as most serious researchers are, to avoid claiming certainty about what the elephants were actually experiencing internally. And that caution matters, because here's the core scientific problem with this entire question. We cannot ask an animal what it feels. We can only observe behavior and infer. This is where a scientist named Barbara King enters the story. King, an anthropologist at the College of William and Mary, has spent years building a framework specifically to study this without falling into either trap: the trap of assuming animals feel nothing, and the trap of assuming they feel exactly what humans feel. In her book, How Animals Grieve, King proposed a working definition. Grief, she argued, can be identified when two conditions are met. First, the animals involved had a close relationship before the death. Second, the surviving animal changes its behavior significantly afterward, showing signs like appetite loss, lethargy, disrupted sleep, or repeated visits to the body, patterns that deviate clearly from its normal routine. Under that definition, evidence starts showing up in species that might surprise you. Chimpanzees, our closest living relatives, have been documented multiple times carrying dead infants for days or even weeks, grooming them, carrying them through the forest, refusing to abandon the body even as it began to decompose. In one case observed by researchers in Zambia in 2017, a chimpanzee mother named Noel was seen using a stem of grass to carefully clean the teeth of her dead infant's mouth, a behavior researchers had never documented before, performed with what appeared to be deliberate, careful attention. Giraffes have been observed standing over dead calves for days, sometimes in groups, occasionally driving off scavengers that approach the body. Dolphins have been recorded supporting deceased pod members at the surface, similar to Taloqua, sometimes for extended periods, refusing to leave even when the group around them moved on. And then there are corvids, crows, and their relatives, which might be the strangest case of all. Biologist Kaylee Swift at the University of Washington ran a series of experiments specifically designed to study crow behavior around death. She placed dead crows in public areas and watched how living crows reacted. What she found was not simple sadness. It was something closer to information gathering combined with danger response. Crows would gather around a dead crow, call loudly, and then avoid that specific location for an extended period afterward, sometimes for weeks. Swift's interpretation is careful and specific. The crows are not necessarily mourning in the way we understand mourning. They appear to be learning. A dead crow in a location is treated as a strong signal that the location itself is dangerous, and that information gets shared and remembered across the group. It is less like a funeral and more like a warning system built on top of what looks, from the outside, like collective distress. This is exactly the kind of finding that makes this question so difficult and so interesting, because it suggests that what looks like grief from the outside might actually be several different things happening under the surface, depending on the species. For elephants and chimpanzees, the evidence increasingly points towards something that resembles emotional attachment and loss. For crows, it might be closer to a sophisticated survival mechanism that happens to look, on the surface, like sorrow. There's another bird case that complicates things even further. In 2009, a study published by researchers observing magpies in Arizona described what they called an apparent funeral. When a magpie discovered a dead magpie, other birds nearby would gather around the body. Some would fly off and return with sprigs of grass, laying them beside the corpse before standing silently for a period of time. The researchers, led by biologist Mark Bakoff, stopped short of calling this proof of mourning, but noted that the behavior was consistent, repeated across multiple observations, and did not appear to serve any obvious practical function like scavenging or feeding. Bakoff, who has spent decades studying emotion in animals, has argued that the burden of proof should not automatically fall entirely on the side of animals feel nothing. If a behavior looks consistent with grief, occurs reliably, and serves no other clear purpose, he argues that dismissing it outright requires just as much justification as accepting it. Then there is the case that most people reading this have probably already witnessed personally, without ever putting a scientific label on it. Domestic dogs, when a companion animal or a human family member in the household dies, frequently show measurable behavioral changes. A study conducted by the Companion Animal Psychology Group and later replicated with veterinary behaviorists found that surviving dogs often ate less, slept differently, vocalized more, and in some cases searched the house repeatedly, checking the same locations where the deceased used to sleep or spend time. This isn't folklore. It's been documented closely enough that veterinary behaviorists now sometimes recommend gradual introduction of scent or routine changes to help a grieving dog adjust, treating it, functionally, the same way a therapist might treat a grieving human client adjusting to an empty house. What ties the magpies and the dogs together with the elephants and the whales is not that they all experienced death identically. It's that in every single one of these cases, the animals had a documented, meaningful relationship before the death occurred, and their behavior changed in a way that consistently deviated from their baseline. That is Barbara King's two-part test again, showing up independently across birds, primates, marine mammals, and household pets. So where does that leave the actual question? Here's what most researchers in this field will tell you if you ask them directly. The strict behaviorist position, that animals cannot possibly feel grief because grief requires a level of self-awareness and future-oriented thinking unique to humans, has become increasingly difficult to defend. We now know many of these species, elephants, dolphins, great apes, corvids, pass mirror self-recognition tests, a classic marker of self-awareness. We know several of them have complex, long-term social bonds that persist for years or decades. We know their brains, while structured differently from ours, contain many of the same core systems involved in human emotional processing, including regions associated with attachment and distress. At the same time, most careful scientists resist saying animal grief is identical to human grief, and there's a good reason for that caution beyond just being conservative. Human grief is entangled with things that may be uniquely human. An explicit understanding of mortality as a permanent, universal concept, cultural rituals built around loss, language that lets us narrate our own suffering to ourselves and others. An elephant standing over a dead herd member almost certainly does not understand death the way you understand death, as an abstract inevitability that will eventually happen to everyone, including itself. But here is the reframe that changes how you might think about all of this. Maybe the question we've been asking is the wrong one. Maybe grief was never a single, unified human invention that animals either have or don't have, like a light switch that's either on or off. Maybe it is better understood as a spectrum, a family of related behaviors and internal states that evolved gradually across many species that live in complex social groups. Under that view, what Taloqua did for 17 days isn't a lesser, simpler version of what a grieving human parent goes through. It's a different point on a much older continuum, a continuum that stretches back far before humans existed, shaped by the same basic evolutionary pressure. Attachment to others is what allows social animals to survive, and losing that attachment costs something, whether or not the animal experiencing that loss can put a name to what it's feeling. Charles Darwin actually wrote about this more than 150 years ago, long before any of this research existed. In The Expression of the Emotions in Man and Animals, published in 1872, he argued that emotional expression exists on a continuum across species, shaped by shared evolutionary history rather than existing as something uniquely human that occasionally, mysteriously, shows up in animals too. For over a century, mainstream science largely ignored that argument. The elephants, the whales, and the crows appear to be proving him right anyway. So the next time you see a video of a grieving animal, a dog waiting by a door for an owner who is never coming back, a dolphin refusing to leave its dead calf, a crow that won't go near a certain tree anymore, you are not necessarily watching a simple biological glitch, and you are not necessarily watching something identical to human sorrow either. You are watching something in between, something old, something that was here long before we were, quietly asking one of the hardest questions in science: where exactly does feeling begin?